Can you give me permission to record on my end?
By all means, please, yes.
Yeah, I need your permission.
You have it.
The setting here says I have to get you to do it.
Oh, you actually need my permission. I thought that was a formality. I don't know how to give you permission.
Okay, don't worry about it.
I don't know how to do it.
Don't worry about it.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Stop stream. Nope, no idea. If somebody over on Facebook understands how to make it so I can let Michael be able to record too, that would be greatly appreciated. And so that is so exciting that we are on over there at the same time. Oh my goodness, Michael. So yes, it even flips over to your screen and now we're both on there. Oh, it's perfect, Michael. All right, officially, everyone who is tuning in, I just had to get over my own little excitement as this is the first time I'm using Zoom live over on Facebook without it facing me, when what I really want you to see is the expert I want to introduce you to. If you're new to me or this work, then you are in store for an absolute treat. Michael Seegers has been studying the teachings of the Ascended Masters for over 40 years. He has devoted himself to hours worth of decrees for us all and has a rigorous spiritual practice with a martial arts background too. An incredible man that is willing to shoulder a lot because he understands what's at stake, because he's been learning from the ones that got to a level that all of us aspire to reach and can, if we are willing to devote ourselves to the spiritual practice that allows us to walk the path up the mountain of awareness. So, Michael, what do you feel most called towards starting now?
Well, we were in a conversation last night when the forces of opposition manifesting through the electronics were just shutting down everything we were trying to say. We're in the daylight now. The darkness is not prevailing. So I wanted to go back to, I was defining the two terms, ascended and master. Many people have never heard those terms, and those who have, I find when I speak to people, they're quite misinformed about the meaning of those terms. So I wanted to take master first. What does it mean to be a master of something, whether it's a craft, a machinist, a painter, an artist, a musician? A master, in my opinion, is someone who is so far, I want to say, trained beyond the level of an expert, that there's a huge noticeable distinction. Experts are a dime a dozen. It only takes a few years to become an expert in something, but it takes a lot more commitment to take that expertise and develop it into mastery, so that your expertise flows so effortlessly and is so self-evident that anybody witnessing your performance would just, without question, admit that you're a master. And it brings to mind another distinction. What's the difference between learning and training? And learning is by definition the change of behavior due to stimulus and response. So as soon as you figure out something new and you change your behavior based on that knowledge, that is the evidence that you have learned something. And training is very different. Training is taking what you learn and ingraining it by repetition, so that the motor skills, so that the nervous system, so that the thought processes all become completely ingrained in a track from which they cannot slide out of. And then the processes become almost automated and almost unconscious. They just flow effortlessly. And so you train yourself in a skill or an ability. And it's training that's required to go from expertise to mastery. So if we look at the example of Jesus and the apostles called him master, and he never asked them to do that, they just called him master because what they witnessed in his presence was so evidently beyond question a demonstration of mastery. And so that's the first distinction. A master in the context of where we're going here is somebody who has attained self-mastery. And the sign over the doorway to the old mystery schools is man, know thyself. Well, once you know yourself, then you have to master yourself. And we all know that we have impulses and tendencies and habits and behaviors that don't serve our best interests. And often we find ourselves quite challenged to change those behaviors. And it requires rigor and discipline and developing new thoughts and new habits. And when one masters that process so that the energy that one is putting out to the universe 24/7 is energy in harmony and is energy that is blessing life no matter what circumstances, so that you're no longer involved in hurtful speech, you're not swearing at people, you're not getting upset, you're not expressing anger, you're in a very loving, forgiving frame of mind and frame of heart at all times. That's self-mastery, and that doesn't come quickly. That takes a lot of training.
And a lot of breaking open.
Pardon me?
And a lot of breaking open those opportunities of going through the sacred sojourn of the soul that take us into the depth of who we are. And
Absolutely.
while you were speaking too, it reminded me too about how you had said previously that the difference between the former occult mystery wisdom schools and present religions per se, I believe you had said, but clarify, is the fact that they no longer ask the vital question that requires a specific answer to advance.
I don't recall having a conversation like that with you. I think you're remembering something you discussed with another individual.
I felt like it was you. I felt the instruction, and maybe it's to bring it into this space for then you to tie it to the teachings of the ascended masters, is about the fact that we're liberating sacred information is the other piece to this.
Absolutely. And I can tell you this, that up until around 1900, the tradition in the mystery schools was that everything was hidden behind a veil, whether it was the way the words were expressed or symbolic terminology was used. Symbols are extremely powerful and can have many layers of meaning. And so many of the things had to be discerned more through an intuitive process. And that has changed. And that's by design. It's for the 20th and the 21st century that the masters have chosen to make things more openly available. They recognize that in society today that humanity is extremely busy, doesn't have the same attention span or the same time available, and won't spend the hours endlessly in contemplation to discern internally some of these things that used to be very hidden. So much of this information is available more openly now once you gain access to a mystery school, such as the one that we run. Going back to our definitions now, the second word I wanted to define was ascended. It's a common term in, shall we say, New Age circles today, and people talk about the ascension process, and there's all kinds of misconstrued ideas expressed about what people think ascension is, and they're not wrong in the sense that it's a raising of vibration. It absolutely is a raising of vibration on a personal and on a planetary level. What I would say 90% of the people using that word don't know is that there is an actual ascension ritual process in which the physical body is burned up in the ascension flame because it's no longer required. And the indwelling spirit, which has spent many lifetimes in training, has actually prepared and woven with filigree strands of light the deathless solar body, which is the vehicle that they will use for all of eternity when they have gone through the ascension process. And so a master, and we can find them in India commonly, in yoga schools, in ashrams, in Buddhist monasteries. And we will call them unascended masters because they're still wearing a vehicle of flesh. They're in the same physical body that they were born in. And they might be in the hundreds of years old, and some might look old and some might look young, but they're still wearing flesh. And they will be what we call unascended masters, and sometimes we're calling them living Buddhas. Some people just call them yogis. The technical term in the mystery schools is arhat. It's spelled A-R-H-A-T. That's the traditional term. And the arhat is someone who has not only gained mastery over the self, but over the physical processes of the body. They can regulate the heartbeat, the blood flow. They can go without sleep for as long as they need to. They can go without food. They've also mastered the elements of the physical plane and the environment so that they can walk on water, or they can walk through fire, or they can levitate, or they can teleport, they can bilocate, they can be in two places at once. And there are people alive today who have these abilities and still wearing flesh. So we call them unascended masters. Those who've gone through what's called the fifth initiation, which is the ascension ritual process, become ascended masters. And at that point, they are no longer subject to reincarnation. They don't have to ever wear a physical body again. They take their light body, they can go anywhere in the universe they want, any dimension, any plane of existence. And occasionally, when required, actually lower the vibration of their light body so it actually feels and appears like flesh. So that you could actually shake hands with them and you wouldn't know that they were an ascended master. You might get a sensation of electricity touching them, perhaps, because their energy is very high frequency. But for all intents and purposes, they can and they do walk around when they have a purpose right here on the physical plane. And one thing the masters want us to understand is that that's how real they are, that's how physical they operate. So that when people are of the idea that ascended masters are disembodied spirits, it's completely erroneous. And there are tens of thousands of intuitive and psychic individuals who have clairvoyant and clairaudient abilities and who often are in touch with consciousness in other dimensions. And honestly and sincerely believe that they are channeling an ascended master. And many of them publish books. And you can find them all over the place, and especially the internet. And I would suggest that the internet is almost the most dangerous place to go looking for authentic information, because 90+% of what's out there is channeled nonsense from mischievous individuals, entities, malicious spirits who are actually masquerading as ascended masters. So you can find dozens of people who publish on their website they're channeling Archangel Michael, they're channeling Saint Germain, they're channeling Jesus, and they believe it. However, if you really do the kind of a study that I did and compare what these people are saying, you're going to find contradictions all over the place. So a master will never contradict themselves, and they'll never contradict another master. And when you get the authentic teachings and you spend the kind of years doing a cross-reference research that I did, you will eventually be able to discern the authentic from the false information. And there are only a few schools that I would rely upon, having done that kind of research, and the volume of information that's available in those sources is overwhelming. It's far more than any individual would require for this journey for an entire lifetime. And so I've always cautioned students to be very careful about where they're going to get their information and what they're looking at, and jumping from one source to another source to another source. You will get often 90% of the information that is factually correct, that you can verify because it's in the news, it's historical, it's recorded somewhere. And then there'll be the 10% of the information that you just take on faith because it sounds right. And that's where the danger is. And starts to lead you down a pathway of misinformation that could be years before you ever discover it. And often you can be too deeply and emotionally invested in that source that you don't want to let go. And part of the not wanting to let go is that they actually implant psychic hooks in you. It makes it harder to get out of that. So we really want to be discerning about the information that we work with, and we want to be really inviting people to engage not just in a process of discernment, but a process of experimentation, so that not just looking at the source of the information, but taking the actual information and finding a way to demonstrate the veracity to yourself. And in that light, we use the science of alchemy, which is a sacred science. And we provide experiments that people can do so they can start to demonstrate cosmic laws to themselves and start to understand these things in a way that they can think properly. Because if you haven't developed proper thinking, it's very comfortable and very easy to be just stuck in believing because you want to believe because it sounds good. And there's a lot of stuff out there that sounds good that's absolute nonsense. So that's my
Absolutely. And I love all of that. And I wanted to say that the question that was asked that no longer is and ties into what we're doing here too is, when do you know you are suffering? I believe was the question.
I don't know I've ever heard that question before. That's a very interesting question. When do you know you're suffering?
Yeah. And the answer that was required for anyone to be able to advance was that when you can see another suffering, you know you are suffering. Because then we understand the universal principle of the law of one.
I am another yourself. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I've never heard that before.
I forget who it was I was having the conversation with. I've had some incredible conversations recently.
Yeah, so that's a huge, huge piece of information that really takes you from the realm of the human into the realm of the divine, is coming to the understanding, the awareness that we're all one. There's only one being in this universe, and we're all part of it. And this human form is just a vehicle. It's a very limited vehicle to express that individuality.
So in terms of the ascended masters that we're most familiar with, what is the story that is not told that is so confusing to so many who aren't sure what's true and what's not anymore, as far as what you've discovered?
I think depending on who you talk to, and I because I've studied the five major religions very intensely, I tend to be very open to having conversation with people of all religious backgrounds. And what I just guess.
What are the five major religions? If you could just.
Well, let's talk about Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We could add Taoism, we could add Jainism, we could add Zoroastrianism. There are others, but those are the five big ones. And what I've discovered is in my conversations, most people who are very devout in their tradition are not very knowledgeable in the scripture of their tradition. So if I talk to a Muslim and I quote from the Quran, often I very much surprise them because they haven't read their Quran, or if they have, I will present a viewpoint or an interpretation that they had not encountered before that actually makes more sense to them. Then there's a whole realm of people who don't have a cultural history of a religious tradition because they grew up in a family that didn't go to church or didn't go to synagogue, or they just didn't really have religion. And they're still good people, and they're still moral, very moral people. They have a good moral compass, but they've been so indoctrinated by the educational system and the scientific paradigm that they will say, really, I don't know why I should believe that there's a God, because I think that theory of evolution kind of makes sense. So whether it's a devout atheist or someone who just hasn't had a reason to probe this idea, many people don't believe in God. And I think it really is an opportunity to ask a gigantic question, which is what I try to do at the beginning of that kind of a conversation, and say, well, before we say what you don't believe in, let's talk about your definition of what is it you don't believe in. What does the word God mean to you? And that's a very interesting place to be, because if you think that God is an old man with a white beard sitting on a throne up on a cloud somewhere in heaven, I'm sure I don't believe in that guy either. Not to say he doesn't exist, but it doesn't work for me very effectively to have that concept. If you start to look in terms of God is everything, God is the consciousness of the universe, and God is the universe, and God is more than that, that's a pretty powerful place to be. And it's kind of difficult to argue from a point of view of science and physics that doesn't help. If physics wants to talk about the Big Bang and how the universe came into existence from a point of nothing, or a point smaller than a pinhead, and just exploded into existence, how does physics explain what was before that? What was before the Big Bang? Where'd that bang come from? Was there timelessness? Was there nothinglessness? No space? No. How did something come out of nothing? Yes.
When I lived in England, I had the privilege of having some really spiritually switched on girlfriends who led me on some different adventures I'm grateful I said yes to. And one of them was to a place where a woman named Louise, I believe her name was, allowed us to come to her farm. And she actually did some readings for the people that would come to this farm. And she would take us back to the moment of the split, when we actually got introduced to the notion of duality, when we no longer were everything and instead were something else. And what was so fascinating was that at the time when she did my reading, I was a chipmunk. And I ended up hiding inside of the hollow of a log, a former tree stump that was actually my ex that I had moved countries to build a life with. I had hid inside of him in that moment of the split when I was so terrified. And it's fascinating because for 4 years I was in that relationship and so much expanded for me. But then it took 5 years to come back from that relationship and actually find safety in myself instead of something outside of myself, which is why this so excites me to be having this conversation, to actually be talking about who God is to us and who we are in relation to it. Because if we think that we are separate from anything because of when we experienced the split and the trauma that came from that separation, which the infant has with the mother when they first come into this material world, if we can actually trace back to the roots of the trauma, and we can actually offer answers, we offer safety and a container and a space in which people can flourish. Because if we know that the land is firm and solid, then we can build on it. But if the sand is shaky, it's the parable from the Bible about building a house on sand versus building a house down deep on the rock.
Yeah, so that's an interesting experience that you had, and I think that the chipmunk is a construct of your mind, symbolically looking to express something. I don't quite think that you were a chipmunk having that revelation. Consciousness does evolve. It evolves through the mineral kingdom into the vegetable kingdom, into the animal kingdom, into the human kingdom, but it does not progress as an individual identity through those stages. Uh, so that's just an interesting experience, and I really don't have a way to relate to that. It's completely your experience. But going back to God and the universe, it's very helpful to go into the kind of literature that India has, the Vedas, the Vedic literature. There's Upanishads, there's Bhagavad Gita, there's Mahabharata, there's Srimad Bhagavatam. There's extensive literature that is written by what were known as the rishis. And the rishis were seers of ancient times who had tremendous ability to see into the distant past. And they recorded what they were able to witness in multidimensional consciousness. And so it is very well known in their tradition how a physical universe is created, the time cycle on which it exists. They have calendars going into the billions and trillions of years that explain this process. And when you read in depth that material and compare it to what quantum physics has to say about how electrons pop into physical reality out of the quantum space, they're describing a similar process. It's like the scientists have almost figured out the what is happening. They don't get the how it's happening. And the how is something the masters have a complete handle on. And it's all consciousness. Consciousness is the fabric of the universe. So whether it's in a spiritual form or a physical form, it's just vibrating on a different frequency. And it could be a massive consciousness like a mountain, or it could be a smaller consciousness like a human. We're certainly not the end of evolution, and where we go in our spiritual progress, eventually we become an ascended master. That's what we're here to do on earth. And it's just the next step on the ladder. And if you talk to the masters about who their teachers are, well, they're cosmic beings on a higher order. And if you talk to those cosmic beings and ask who their teachers are, they will describe beings that we can't even understand on a higher order. And so one example that I like to give in just as an illustration, we know that there are cosmic beings that can hold the sun in the palm of their hand. Our solar system is that small to them. That's quite a concept.
It reminds me of the Ronald Dahl book, the BFG, I think it is, or one of the ones where it's worlds upon worlds upon worlds, where each one is looking upon the world as if they are observing it, not realizing they are also being observed.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that process is that it is infinite. And you go back to this question about infinity and before the Big Bang and that kind of thinking. And I have this conversation from time to time with individuals, and I discover their limitation is where I was in my youth. I had a very similar limitation. It drove me nuts as a child, contemplating this. The idea of nothingness. What if there was, I remember being 6 and 7 years old and in moments of anger, being upset with the world, having the idea, I wish I was never born. Why did I have to be here? And then trying to imagine what it was like if I had never been here, if my mother had never been here. What if nobody had ever been here? What if nothing ever existed? And try to embrace nothingness as a concept. And it was impossible to do. Well, people get stuck in that. And most people have gone down that rabbit hole in their casual thinking. And you get to the point, well, if everything began out of nothing, then what was before the nothing? There had to be something. You can't have that condition of nothingness. It's impossible. It never could have been. Therefore, the alternative, when we say God always was and always will be, God had no beginning. Ouch, that makes my brain hurt. You can't go infinitely back into the past forever and ever and ever. But logic will tell you that it had to be that way because there couldn't have been a starting point. Because what was before the starting point? And this is where surrender has to come in. And you have to just say, as much as it bothers me, I have to accept it. Because it really doesn't make sense the other way around. There could not have been something before nothing. So it always was, it always will be. And that's part of the definition of, for me anyway, what God is. God is everything, period. Everything, everywhere, all the time, since forever, forever.
Energy cannot be created nor destroyed. It can only be transmuted or moved.
Or change form or differentiate, or as you talk about the split is when oneness, and that's really what the masters use for terminology. They just talk about oneness. When oneness splits into the observer and that which is observed, there's your duality. And from there, it just splits farther down and farther down. And there's a whole process. We don't need to get into that today. It's too big of a topic. There's a whole process about how souls evolve and how they're born and how they go on to their progression. But one concept that a lot of people question and they don't know how to find evidence for is this idea of reincarnation. And it's a very important concept to work with because the law of karma doesn't make any sense without it. And if you look at that little toy, it's called Newton's cradle. There's 5 balls hanging on strings, and you move one ball and you let it go, and on the other end, one ball comes off. And if you pull 2 out on this side, then 2 come out the other side. And it just demonstrates Newton's law of for every action, there's an equal opposite reaction. And basically, that's the law of karma. And we all know, we all say what goes around comes around. We get that, but we don't live 24/7 like we get that, because we still do things that are not nice. And it comes back in ways that usually we don't recognize because it comes back through a different avenue. So when we say pay it forward, it's living in the understanding that concept works, but it's just going to come back somewhere else. But looking at the conditions of the planet and the injustice and the crime and the war and the poverty and the hardship really makes it difficult to rationalize that there is a law of karma or that there is a divine justice. And the truth is, that law is there and it is operating, but it's operating on a larger time scale than you've had the opportunity to observe. What have you been able to observe in one lifetime? And usually with short attention spans, you'll be observing today or tomorrow or remembering last week or last year. And some of these karmic effects that are in motion were put in motion a long time ago and won't actually boomerang back to us for a long time into the future. Mm-hmm. But when you can accept reincarnation, that you actually chose your parents from a number of choices that were given to you based on merit, based on what you had earned, also based on limitations that you had created by your inability to do things or know things or accept things. It's no accident that you were not born in a third world country, blind and crippled. You were born here in a culture with some comforts and some advantages. And that's based on merit. So karma and reincarnation are two of the really fundamental concepts that students of the masters want to develop an understanding about. Yes.
And also the body elemental as part of that, which is a concept very foreign to most people. But when I was living in England, another teacher that I attended a workshop of spoke of the body elemental and honoring that. And so bringing that into this conversation as well, to say that as much as all of this is about the higher levels of spiritual awareness, this is very much about grounding all of that to make it physical, to have a practice, something to be able to hold on to. So there are practical things that obviously in what is being shared today, you're gaining insight into what is behind the why. And then it's really getting back to our own why as the foundation of why we're doing all of that and all of this. It feels that was important for somebody just to be reminded that the why is at the center, the what is inside of that, and the how is on the outside. The how is less important. If we understand the why, it will drive the way.
Body elemental is a very, very interesting subject. And before we can really do justice to that topic, we have to talk about what is the elemental kingdom. And so there are two systems people encounter. One is a Western system in which if you look at astrology and you see that the astrological chart is divided into 4 elements: fire, air, water, and earth. And you will come into a huge question when you say, well, what about the Chinese system where there's 5 elements and they have metal and wood in there? And so 5 element system of the Orient is a system that describes a process. It's very, very different. I want to talk about the Western system with the 4 elements: fire, air, water, and earth, because it describes the nature and structure of the physical plane. The terms fire, air, water, and earth are symbolic terms. So the plane of fire is rightfully known as the etheric plane. It's the highest vibrating aspect of the physical plane. The air element is the mental plane, and it's the next lower vibrating aspect of the physical plane. The water element is the emotional plane, and then the earth is the physical, lowest vibrating, most dense aspect. But all 4 of those vibrational fields are interpenetrating and combined together form physical matter. So all the atoms that we understand in science are all made of those 4 forces and others, but we're just going to keep it really simplified and talk about fire, air, water, and earth. Now, if the fabric of the universe is consciousness, then all of these vibrating fields are conscious. Everything is conscious. In the Bible, there's an interesting verse where Jesus was preaching, and some Roman soldiers came by and they told him to, keep it down, you're too loud. And Jesus said to them, even these rocks would cry out to the glory of God if you had ears to hear them. And that's where I get this phrase, if stones could speak. Well, stones can speak. And that's why I like working with crystals, because the mineral kingdom has a tremendous intelligence to it. And so whether it's on the atomic level, on the molecular level, something that you can hold in your hand the size of a pebble or larger, or something as big as a mountain, that is an elemental life force energy, many of whom have actual individual identity, and we call them elementals. And there are elementals in the fire kingdom, and they're known as salamanders, and they could be a flame on a match or a candle. They could be raging 20 feet tall in a forest fire. They're found in volcanoes. And they are natural agents of transmutation. Everything gets transmuted by fire. We look in the sky and we see the wind blowing and the clouds blowing, and that is all the work of the elementals of the air kingdom. They are known as sylphs. And they are tremendous allies and can become very powerful friends. However, they have very strict requirements to develop that relationship. And then there are the water element, the elementals known as undines, and they work in the physical plane of water. They work in the emotional energy. Excuse me. We talk about dolphins and their consciousness, and my understanding is that they are actually elementals, and they have an intelligence that's far beyond, and whales as well, intelligence far beyond what we might imagine. Their operating level of their consciousness spans hundreds and thousands of miles. And then in the physical kingdom, we have the gnomes, and people have little statues in their front lawns and their gardens, little garden gnomes. They're the elementals of the earth kingdom. And then within all four of those families of elementals, there are all kinds of subspecies. In the fire elementals, if you look in the catalogs of the masters, they've got hundreds and hundreds of pages of descriptions of the different types of fire elementals. And the same with the air and the water. In the air, we find fairies, and you can find many descriptions of different types of fairies and nymphs out in the forest. When we come to accept this idea that the elemental creatures exist, the elemental kingdom exists, then we can start to look at what is the body elemental. And it turns out that one of the things that elementals do that they're trained for, that they are on what's called an involutionary arc, so that consciousness evolves from spirit down into matter and from matter back up into spirit. And it's a cyclic process. Actually, if you look three-dimensionally, it's a torus. And in that descending arc, consciousness develops through the elemental kingdom, eventually reaches the lowest point of density, and then begins to move upward back into the spiritual kingdom. And it's on that upward arc that we find ourselves in the journey in the human form. In order to hold the pattern for a physical material, a rock, a blade of grass, a tree trunk, a frog, a human body, or whatever, there's a cellular structure that has to be held together. There's an atomic structure that has to be held together. And it is the work of the elementals to do that. And they have to be trained to memorize and hold the electronic pattern for that, whatever it is. When an elemental, through thousands of years of its evolution, develops sufficient skill and proficiency and endurance to demonstrate infallibly it can hold an electronic pattern, no matter what the interference, no matter what the environment, they can go into training to become a body elemental to work with a human. And all humans have a body elemental who has been with them since their first embodiment. So your body elemental will be a being that's been highly trained, back to that word training, highly skilled, specifically tailored to your individual need, your divine plan, what you are intended to do in your span of multiple lifetimes on your pathway to ascension. And your body elemental will be one of the governing factors in the creation of your physical body in your mother's womb. So from the moment of conception, the body elemental is working with the mother, is working with the body elemental of the mother, is working with the Holy Christ self, is working with the I Am Presence, and is based on the merit and the limitations of the karma of that individual, is creating the most efficient form possible for that embodiment. And that body elemental is with you through the whole gestation process, is with you through the birth process, and is by your side until the day you die, and will be with you again in your next lifetime, all the way through the progression until your ascended state. So the body elemental is a very powerful ally to be in tune with. It stands generally less than 3 feet tall. They look just like you. The form that you have, what you see when you look in the mirror, that's the form and the pattern that they are holding and expressing through you. So your body elemental stands beside you, sits beside you. It's always at your side. It's very small, maybe 2.5 feet tall. And it is encumbered by momentums of your choosing. So that when you have bad habits, the body elemental, which is trained as a mimic, often takes on those particular habits as well. If you want to help your body elemental, you have to cut it free from some of those momentums. As you're working on yourself, you can cut your body elemental free. We do that with the Archangel Michael sword. But coming into attunement with the body elemental, learning to give prayers for the body elemental, things of that nature, will be hugely beneficial and can be very restorative in health challenges. And we've had individuals who doctors had said they had no answers, and we gave them instruction about the body elemental, and we gave them exercises to do. And they've had recoveries that the doctors just could not believe were possible. So one of your best friends, along with your guardian angel, is your body elemental.
And it strikes me that it's very tied to the inner child archetype as well. That is one of the 4 survival archetypes, which are also the victim, prostitute, and saboteur. And it's these 4 survival archetypes that come with us and either stand in their scared aspect or the sacred aspect. And if we actually understand the sacred practices that have been hidden before, then we can start moving out of that scared state that keeps us stressed and fearful, which means we can't be faithful, because love and fear cannot coexist, and faith is the expression of love walking in physical form as you and I, the earth angels that are here to be the ascended masters that future generations speak of, and that everyone who made it here, of which we had 4 trillion to 1 chances, odds, to being the souls that were chosen, according to the lawyer Mel Robbins. She uses that as a brilliant statistic, because people like statistics. But then if we actually look at possibilities compared to performance, we understand the gap has to be first transcended within our own selves, which is why gaining access to tools like the insights Michael has shared today are so profound. Thank you.
No, you're very welcome.
Thank you for doing the work. Thank you for doing the inner work so that we can sit in a conversation like we're having a conversation any other day. Thank you for being who you've become to be able to have mastered what you know to sit there and do what you do as you do. Thank you. Seriously, for all of us, from all of us.
You're all very welcome.
I hope that you who have been watching have been able to feel what it means to have faith in what you're saying, because you've sifted through so much. You've learned to discern truth from falsehood yourself, learning your own language. Can you speak into how understanding your soul's language, how that actually ties into what we're doing here?
I'm not sure where you're going with that. I'm not sure what you're describing with the soul's language, or what you think I might be able to say about that.
Our heart song. So I feel like introducing the sacred sojourn of the soul, which is the template that I've taken from the hero's journey and then applied to the spiritual journey that we're walking together as individuals at this time, which starts out at home in the comfort zone of the known. And then you hear the call which is essentially what this is a piece of, because once you've heard the call, then you veil the unrest with coping mechanisms of choice that keep us playing small until we meet the mentor, guide, or teacher that gives us faith in ourselves to say that, you know what, I can do that thing that I felt called to do, because we wouldn't have the desire if we didn't have the ability to fulfill it. God is not cruel. It's just not always kind for how we need to learn in order to be shaped and carved into who we need to be to show up to the next moment ready for what's coming. And that then is when we accept the call and step into the liminal phase of change, being in between worlds. The world we used to know, the world we're getting to, and then the world we're in between is that liminal phase of nothingness. No longer them, no longer not yet that, and somehow having to figure out who we are in the meantime. And it feels very messy for the caterpillar to be in the cocoon, being completely broken down before, in the moment it thinks it's about to die, then it transforms into the most magnificent butterfly I could have imagined. But before it can get to that place, it has to go through the trials and tribulations of this unknown land and territory that take us into the dark KNIGHT of the ego, the dark night of the ego, when we go into the experience of meeting the archetypal patterns of victimhood and woundology that kept us in stories instead of our hearts. And then we enter into the dark light of the soul, which is when we enter into the innermost cave that challenges us to face who we truly are. But first we have to bypass the dragon, which is the fierce part of ourselves, that inner child, I believe, that has learned to defend itself and use coping mechanisms to distract us from the very essence of who and whose we truly are, because of all the dogma that we've acquired and then had compete around us doesn't help. And then once we've actually entered this space, we go through that phoenix process of death and rebirth simultaneously, because while energy cannot be created nor destroyed, only displaced, what it means is the opposite side of the same coin is birth and death. And that then is when the new self-image is reborn as the one that we were waiting for before and now have become, through the process of integrating all that we learned from the lessons of the journey that took us into the depth of who we never knew that we always were but always hoped to become. And then we embody a new energetic signature, which is what masters do when they have been through so much that now they know who they are and can then contribute the wisdom that ultimately brings us back where we started, knowing it for the first time, because our eyes have completely transformed.
Well, I think you just did that better than I could. It was reminding me of a phrase that I heard from Tony Robbins. He said, our greatest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. And that's what you were really speaking to, is that coming into that awareness of who we are as a divine being with infinite potential, and the masking techniques people use. It's not something I'm quite as familiar with, because I was pretty much a rebel from birth, and I was going to do things my way. And I was just here for a purpose, and really didn't let anything stop me from achieving that. I had to know, and I had an intense driving need to know, and it took me on a pathway that was very painful, and it was the only pathway that would get me here. And so a lot of that you were speaking to is a little bit foreign to me, but I totally get that it makes sense that people go through that.
It's an archetypal model of what generally I believe most stories follow, because that was how Joseph Campbell had portrayed the hero's journey. And yet the hero's story requires there be a victim in order for the hero to have a role. The damsel in distress has to be in distress in order for Prince Charming to come along and be a desirable option, because generally if we're not suffering, we don't have much desire to change unless the change seems like a better option or alternative.
Yeah, that's reminds me of a verse in the Bible about learn he obedience by the things which he suffered. And it's referring to obedience to natural law. The whole universe operates on natural law. And no point kicking against it. You know, you see a tidal wave coming, you run, get out of the way. You don't stand there and shake your fist and say, I don't want to get wet.
Yeah. Right.
And it's, a lot of the natural laws are not so obvious due to cultural conditioning. And we grew up with belief systems and ideas about how we think things are or how they should be. Natural law doesn't care.
No.
That tidal wave is going to come.
Yeah.
And it's learning about cycles in nature, from the small, by the second, by the minute, to seasonal cycles. We're wise enough to plant grains in the spring, not in the winter. And there are cycles that are longer than that. There are cycles that operate on non-physical planes. This is why astrology is such a powerful tool, that once you start to really look at it scientifically, you can make a lot of sense out of energy cycles. And bringing your life into alignment with cycles and natural law, the only benefits, it just makes things a lot easier to do.
Right. Having some structure really helps, even if you really like living out of the box, which I've always been someone that struggled to fit in wherever I was, which was why I created the group Where Misfits Fit. I figure if there are so many of us, and they always say in every family there is a black sheep, well, what if all of us who found ourselves on the fringes decided that instead of feeling isolated, rejected, and unloved, which I don't say I feel those things, because I have gratefully been born into a family where I was very much loved. And so for that, I am incredibly grateful. And then I lose my train of thought.
Well, you had touched upon the word structure, and so I want to.
Move it up higher. Yes.
There it is.
Very well done. This is your business card, yes?
Well, this is a design concept for a business I started, and then I gave it over to my partner. But this is my line: discipline is the foundation of freedom. And I want to talk about that for a minute, because structure is all about discipline. You want a square, you can't have wavy lines. So there is a discipline to the geometry of the square. And at the atomic level, all atoms have a discipline to their function. And you couldn't have cellular biology, and you couldn't have a physical body, and you couldn't have life if there was not some discipline and structure to all of it. And going back to the atheist question about, did it really happen by chance that there was a big bang and there was a planet and somehow there was life evolved by accident because some atoms got together in the proper arrangement? If you took a paper bag and threw in a dozen marbles, and each one had a number on it from 1 to 12, and now close your eyes and pull marbles out of the bag and do it in the right order, starting from 1 to 12, you can't do it. And the odds of pulling them out in the right order are in the trillions to 1. Well, if you can't pull 12 marbles out of a bag, how by chance could you have all the trillion things happen that needed to happen to create life? There is order and discipline and intelligence behind all of it. There has to be. And so when you accept that, and when you accept the idea that by coming into knowledge, understanding, and attunement with cosmic law, natural law, and govern your life according to that, that requires discipline. And that discipline is the foundation of freedom. And without that discipline, you will be the slave to all the impulses that you have not yet learned to govern because you don't have the self-mastery. And that's the journey of self-mastery. That's the journey from the human condition to the ascended master condition of divine perfection.
The funny thing, ironic thing, is that I lost my train of thought when we were talking about structure and I was saying I had so little of it. Then I remember that what I was saying was about where misfits fit, and it being an opportunity for all of us who feel like we haven't fit in this toxic system that we have been living in. Germ theory is very much of the idea you put a healthy fish in a dirty tank and the fish gets sick and you vaccinate the fish, compared to when you actually decide to choose to clean the tank and then help the fish. This ultimately is how we can do that, but it's only by actually coming together, organized together in strength of numbers, understanding that when we do that, we become the wave. We don't get hit by the wave. We are the wave that radiates out and changes the world by radiating out from our own vibrational circle where we are, emitting a new energy that resonates and respects and reflects the magnificence of the ultimate mother who has supported all of us. And without her, we do not get to be here. So as much as we're talking about the ascended masters, what all of them knew was the importance of incorporating her too into the whole picture.
Divine Mother is everything. And we'll find that at the core of the Master's teachings. And what we'll also find is, just as we are reaching out to people via electronics and technology, we are the recipients of the reaching out by the Masters to us. And it always works that way. And it reminds me of the movie The Matrix. Neo didn't go looking for Morpheus. Morpheus found Neo. I didn't find the Masters found me. And now we're going out and finding the rest of them.
I love earlier how you had talked about the Rishi people, because
Oh, the Rishis, yes, the seers.
I had gotten involved with Organo Gold, which is a coffee company, back
Yes.
earlier in the year. And I actually joined on the day my grandma passed away, the day after, in fact. I believe it was August or April 11th. But the point of it is the fact the reishi mushroom is actually what is inside of this product line, because of how helpful it is to our neurocircuitry to be able to use the myceli of the mushroom within our own neuro pathways, and how it's a intricate root system spread underneath of the earth we don't have the capacity to see, but that ultimately is a reflection of the inner mind, and then also the map of the world that each of us make up target destinations. Each of us are aspects of the divine incarnate with our mark in a particular place, because as light bearers, as lighthouses in this world, we're holding unique locations. And all of it, while we may feel alone on the surface, we must understand there is a root system underneath of us that supports us and is like the internet we have access to, because if we fail to go within, we will go without. And if we think about, instead of it being the internet that's outside and being manipulated with 5G technology and all the rest, if we actually go from the internet to the internet to then the internet, the intranet rather, the akashic field of sorts that give us access to all information from all time, understanding all of it's happening now like the multi-dimensional layer cake that time really is. It gives us a whole different perspective of life generally. And then when we come to these new realizations that give us that little emoticon with the little cloud when his mind's blown, when we get into that space and don't feel safe, that can actually feel more harmful because we're in that liminal phase in between where we found access to new information that resonates. And yet it's taken us away from the belief system that previously we knew, and now we have to maneuver that gap, and it's terrifying. What do you recommend to people that are going through that right now, as in the outer world so much gets destroyed in order for new growth to form underneath and in place of where that used to be?
Well, before I answer that, I want to just touch upon, you were describing reishi mushroom, which is spelled R-E-I-S-H-I, also known as lingji. It was the mushroom that was reserved for the emperors. I was using the word rishi, which is in the Sanskrit tongue, and it's no E in that. It's just R-I-S-H-I. So the rishis were the ancient seers, and the reishi is the mushroom. Very similar sounding. Now, you wanted me to offer recommendation for, what was it, dealing with fear?
Cognitive dissonance.
Oh, I haven't figured that one out yet. I encountered people who are very, very intelligent, who are very learned in subjects that I would have them believe would just automatically get the truth, and they don't. And it's like banging against a stone wall. I don't know how to break through that. I don't even think it's wise to try and break through it. When people are in denial, that cognitive dissonance is their protection. They need that. They're not ready to let it go. I don't think it's our job to try and force that down. I don't know how to do that, and I don't want to. I prefer to interact with those individuals in the most loving, friendly way possible, and not try to push past their belief system. Once I encounter the strength of their resistance, it's not my job to convince them. I'm here to share what I've learned through experience, through experimentation, through demonstration and proof with those who are open to that. Not everybody's open to that. And the masters have said, for those who have faith, no proof is required. And for those without faith, no proof is sufficient. So Jesus could stand in front of you and turn water into wine. You're going to go, it's a trick. Let me check under his robe. He's got a pitcher of wine somewhere. Sleight of hand. You can demonstrate real magic, and they won't believe it. And science is that way. And wasn't it Arthur Clarke who was talking about any culture sufficiently advanced will demonstrate their technology to a lower level understanding, and it will appear as magic. So you got a caveman and you flick a Bic lighter and he jumps back frightened because he doesn't understand fire. Well, it's the same thing. So people in their level of being stuck wherever they are, if they're not open to learning, you can't teach them.
No.
And so you move on and you go, you know what? That's not, you're not the one I'm here for.
Yeah.
And God bless you, and hope you have a wonderful life. And I move on to who's next and who's next and who's looking for. I got the cookie. I got a really good cookie here. Who's looking for the cookie?
Right. And I'm not even specifically speaking about the ones that didn't even know I am lying to themselves. Denial. I'm not speaking about the ones in denial. I'm speaking about the ones that are ready to learn and grow and know and feel the truth, and yet are still experiencing that limbo experience of being in the same place where they were before, except for now having new eyes to see what they used to see with old eyes, which now feels completely foreign and different, and therefore
Oh,
scary.
so now they have fear, and how do you deal with the new paradigm? Because now you have an understanding that you're not liking very much.
Or not even that you're not liking it, but that competes with the existing beliefs that make it so that someone is going to die. And it's going to either be the new self-image as one who identifies with the information that was just received that resonates and makes sense and fits within the inner world that's being created, compared to the one that used to believe something contradictory or competing that ultimately has to go in order for this new one to replace that. Not to say it can't still be, because it always will be within the recesses of the internet library of sorts. But at the same time, they've changed. They're in the same
Okay, so
spot.
there's a simple answer, I think. You have to be willing to think. And one of the videos I put on our channel very recently is a little 6-minute video, and talks about the habit of laziness of thinking. And people are often very conditioned to wanting instant answers. So it's instant gratification in the mind or in the mental body. And one of my favorite phrases is, "Oh, please don't make me think," when I describe the condition that people are in. Because people often live their lives in that way. They don't want to think, they want to obey, they want to just do what they're told. Please give me a path to walk so I can walk it. Don't make me think, don't make me figure it out. Oh, please, that's just too much work. And it's true that mental labor is much more difficult than physical labor. It takes tremendous effort to think. But when you're caught between paradigms and looking for resolution within yourself, you better be willing to think and take the time to think and figure out how to think and get the information you need to help you think, but be willing to think.
There's a common saying that 90, what is it? It's 95% people, 95% of people think they think. 3% of people would rather die than think, and 2% of people actually think. It's very small who are
Yeah,
actually thinking, because so many people are just on autopilot, letting the subconscious drive, which the subconscious contains all access to information that we've ever had. So it's like the internet that contains every single file for every destination, every thought, every consideration, all of it's in there. And we can go into our memories and pluck out different aspects from the subconscious that are relevant to the search that we're pulling up right now because of what we're investigating in that moment.
and that process again really requires
Discipline.
you got to discipline your thinking as much as you have to discipline everything else about your life. Yeah. Thinking, we all know, will take you from here to somewhere you didn't expect if you just let it flow. An idea comes into your mind and it triggers a word or a thought, and suddenly you're thinking about something else. And within 30 seconds, you're saying, how did I get to that idea? From a memory from 40 years ago, got triggered by 5 thoughts ago, because thinking just flows in a way that is very not understood. So it takes focus. You have to take your attention and focus and say, no, I would like to think about such and such. And that thought doesn't serve me, and that memory doesn't serve me right now, because I want to think about this thing that's in front of me. And so it takes work.
We have a related thought to the last every 7 seconds, they say. So if we're on a downward spiral of thinking, we'll have another thought to join the last every 7 seconds. So it's very easy to experience the compound effect of negativity very quickly. And the same is also true if we choose to interrupt that old pattern of self doubt and self destruction, to be able to have a PPS, I call it, a personal power statement, to be able to reference, to come back to, as the guide that says, okay, I used to go down this rabbit hole that used to really see me bruised and battled, scarred afterwards, and now I'm going to choose this instead, and just have some easy statements to access that can really support you. And personal power statements are what I came up with as the easy reference point, just so that we can know what we're talking about when we're talking about an acronym of which every industry is so filled. And this is also relevant to one of the upcoming interviews that Michael and I will be doing, where we will talk about the power of the spoken word and the necessity to exercise the discipline of mind, body, spirit, and practice to be able to fully get ourselves to do the inner work and the practices that support that inner excavation that is required when we go inside and find aspects of ourselves we forgot, buried, tried to pretend didn't exist, and now discover are actually quite beautiful when we just can understand how precious we are as beings that contain all possibilities of personality aspects. It's just as to which ones we will give our energy to, which is why I always say that we need to add the E into humanity for us to be able to be the ones that intentionally direct the energy of where we're putting our effort, attention, energy, money, and time, because ultimately those are the team players that determine where we're going to be at the end of this life and whether we will be one of the ones that history talk about in retrospect, which we're now living now.
Yes, wonderful.
So we've been on for an hour and a half together, and that is quite a good deep dive for people who are new to you, the teachings of the Ascended Masters, who had never heard of the body elementals, or so many of the other things we discussed. And I'm so grateful for your generosity of time in educating me in the first place before we chose to bring this information to a more public sphere so that others can benefit as you draw near to the information here too. And we've got a few comments, so I'm just gonna pull those up. Angela says, I hear you, 4 years with, and now I'm on my own road finding myself. So just resonance as to needing to go within. There are no questions as such that have been posted here, but we didn't specifically express that as a possibility. So what we're going to do now is to offer that opportunity to anyone watching this in retrospect. Please post your questions and be sure to tag myself, since Michael is not directly on Facebook, though the Shambhala Temple of Light page is available, and we will post the link for that when this message is posted to YouTube later. But please ask your questions. What did this interview make you think? What did it make you question? Where do you wish we had went that maybe we didn't? Or would you like for us to go next time? We've got a lot of really exciting information and opportunities coming to you in the near future. And so we want to make this as conversational as possible, because it's not about being better than anyone. It's not about saying how far anyone has come to get where we've got, but simply to say that every mountain has a next higher peak, and we're all trying to scale that mountain one step at a time. So be graceful with yourself. And what you don't know and are curious about, ask. And maybe we don't know, but maybe we do, or maybe we know someone who does, because what I know for sure is John Maxwell always used to say, and still likely does, I just haven't been plugging in recently, is that no one of us are as great as all of us. Together we are stronger. When we unite in the name of the light and what is right, how can we lose? When Fear was walking through the dark, he came across a house in the dark with lights on inside. And when he knocked on the door and love answered, no one was there, because love and fear cannot coexist. And there are a lot of really terrifying storylines that are being told right now. And I go down some of those rabbit holes too, I'll admit. But the truth is that if instead of focusing on that, to give it our energy and increase the chances of that being what comes out of the opportunity that we all have now to create a new future, what we have to understand is our power to choose to create something together so that we can weave all of our misfitting selves together to become the quilt that ultimately keeps the whole world warm.
Very good.
Thank you, Michael.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
Any final words?
Have an awesome day.
Namaste.